As we learn more about those great Americans who helped gain equality for women in the United States Constitution, there are two names that you should know about. Ida B. Wells, who was formerly of Memphis, originally from Holly Springs, Mississippi, and she ran out of Memphis, fled to Chicago after her business and livelihood were threatened. She was a true activist, a true pioneer. She understood racism and sexism, and she joined forces with Alice Paul to have black women march to gain suffrage. She formed the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, and she was a significant figure in all areas of equality for women and for minorities. I found this great sculpture on Beale Street in Memphis, where I live, and this is Ida B. Wells having a conversation with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, of course, was a staunch abolitionist, as was Ida B. Wells, and he was friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, two of the more prominent suffragists, and probably the two most well-known icons of the suffrage movement. They both had newspapers, they were prolific writers, they understood the significance of equality under the law, and they were quite victorious, I think, in many areas of their lives and certainly in their influence in our country. In our book, The Perfect 36, Tennessee Delivers Women's Suffrage, we have a lot of information about Ida B. Wells and Frederick Douglass. If you'd like to learn more, go to our website, www.theperfect36.com. Every time an election rolls around, we hear the lecture, oh, you should go vote. People died for your right to vote. That's true. As the widow of a Vietnam veteran, I can tell you I take that very seriously. However, as a student of the women's suffrage movement, I want young people in particular to understand, and for all people to understand, why that vote matters. The suffragists believe that democracy is not a spectator sport. Democracy does not work if people don't participate. And when I speak to young people, I tell them, you must exercise your right to vote, because you know what? There are people who don't want you to vote. And that's why there are efforts to suppress the vote. This is what other countries do when they don't want people to vote. Dictatorships and oppression of people. In a democracy, we have the right to vote. You have the right to express your opinion. You can run for office. You can work for candidates. You can certainly petition your government for the redress of your grievances, which is what Susan B. Anthony did quite eloquently. I'm very proud of the DVD that we have, which is in the Smithsonian's Political Reference Files. It tells 72 years of history for American women to win the right to vote. Generations, American women win the vote. This was the largest nonviolent struggle in the history of the United States. It was very important. 27 million American women were enfranchised for the first time in 1920, and they achieved this goal without firing a single shot. They didn't kill anybody, and they probably could have. But it's important to know that Tennessee, my state, was the last state that could possibly make it law. I wrote a cover story for the Tennessee Bar Journal in September, October of 1995, telling the wonderful story of how ratification fell to Tennessee. What I want is for you to appreciate your right to vote, because Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, said, women have suffered an agony of soul that you can never comprehend, that your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it. To get more information, go to our website, www.theperfect36.com or www.paulacasey.com. How does the women's suffrage movement affect American politics today? That's a really interesting question. And if you look back through history at how American women were inspired to work for the right to vote, you need to look at what happened with the Iroquois. The Iroquois women actually had sovereignty, and they inspired leaders such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Women were always included in the decision making. It was never a question of whether they would be, they just were. And in our country, Everybody thinks too wrongly that people came over on the Mayflower and that they all had the right to vote, and that's not the way it was. Initially, at the beginning of our country, it was only white men with property who could vote. Fortunately, the founding fathers and the women behind them made sure that we had the amendment process, and because our Constitution can be expanded, voting rights have been granted to many other groups. I happen to think that the ratification of the 19th Amendment was one of the most important events in American history. Not only was it the greatest nonviolent struggle in the history of our country, it provided opportunities for women to be involved in the leadership and governing of their country. This is what the suffragists envisioned. This is what we have in our book, The Perfect 36, Tennessee Delivers Women's Suffrage, because as the ratification effort gained steam, it looked like one more state would not be able to be obtained, but fortunately it came to my state, Tennessee, the last state that could possibly ratify in August 1920. Since that ratification effort, we've had more women run for office, and we have been very fortunate to have had Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. Speaker Pelosi sent me a very nice thank you note when we gave her a copy of our book, which she included in her personal library. I really am proud that Nancy Pelosi was our speaker because I think she's a great role model for young women. She also represents what is possible when women can rise to leadership. I also have to tell you as an aside, I have a joke that we will have achieved true equality when we tolerate mediocre women like we've always tolerated mediocre men. And I think we've gotten there so far with some of the other women who've been in elective office and maybe some of those who've quit. But anyway, I think it's important for us to remember that American women and the men who supported them and the men who voted in those 36 state legislatures believed in ratification as a right and that the right to vote was something that should not be denied. For more information, if you want to read more about our book, go to www.theperfect36.com. Where did political symbols come from? Surprisingly, the women's suffrage movement was the first to wear banners for their cause, to hold placards, to march in parades, to chain themselves in front of the White House in support of a political cause, and to come up with colors that represented the movement. The American women's suffrage movement is a great political and social movement to study. I'm wearing the suffrage colors, purple, white, and gold. The yellow rose was the symbol of suffrage. Purple represented royalty of womanhood. White represented purity in the home and in politics. And yellow represented the crown of victory. Originally, the sunflower in Kansas was used to represent the dawn of a new day, and then anecdotally, it was believed that Susan B. Anthony's mother loved yellow roses, so the yellow rose became a symbol of suffrage. I always wear purple, white, and yellow in support of the suffragists when I speak. So anything I find with yellow roses, I get it. I think it's important for us to understand that the placards and banners and all of the political symbolism that we see today originated with the women's suffrage movement. These women were really amazing. They were the ones who found all kinds of ingenious ways to get across their message. Remember, this was before TV, before anything that we see today, certainly before the internet. They were able to be persuasive for a political cause by incorporating colors and flowers and banners and placards, all of the things that we take for granted. This is really amazing when you think about how they did this because they were struggling to be heard amidst a sea of absolute apathy. I mean, unless you really cared about the right to vote, were you really going to pay that much attention? And certainly the newspapers of that time they ran a few things, but there was also a lot of opposition. In our book, The Perfect 36, Tennessee Delivers Women's Suffrage, we cover both the pro and con side of the women's suffrage movement. And at that time, it was called women's suffrage, W-O-M-A-N, because that was considered inclusive. And today we say women's suffrage. To learn more, get our book, go to www.theperfect36.com. are very fortunate that Dr. Jan Sherman, who is a prominent historian and who chairs the history department at the University of Memphis in Memphis, Tennessee, was the co-author of The Perfect 36, Tennessee Delivers Women's Suffrage. Dr. Sherman has had a lifetime of terrific research on women and politics, and she was the co-author with the late, great Carolyn Yellen, also of Memphis, for our book. This was the story that Carol Lynn always wanted to tell. And when we initially talked about doing this book back in 1995, Carol Lynn was working on a book about Kasturba Gandhi, and Dr. Sherman was working on her book about Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine. Her book, No Place for a Woman, A Life Senator Margaret Chase Smith, is also available. Great book. I highly recommend you read it. Dr. Sherman also has been very supportive in helping us spread the word about our DVD, which tells 72 years of history in under 13 minutes. Now, how can you incorporate this in a classroom? Doesn't matter if it's junior high, high school, college curriculum, American history, civics, women's history, whatever. But Dr. Sherman wrote a teacher activity guide, which we include with the purchase of every DVD. And what she did was come up with 2 pages that outline how teachers can incorporate the book and DVD in their curriculum. This is really great information. I'm the daughter of a 30-year public school teacher in Nashville, Tennessee, and I can tell you my mother thought this was great. She said she would have used it when she was teaching. So if you want to learn more about the book and the DVD and how to incorporate it into your classroom curriculum, go to www.theperfect36.com.